Here is what is confirmed. After weeks of forensic analysis, witness interviews, surveillance footage examination, and the methodical accumulation of physical and behavioral evidence that has defined every phase of the Nancy Guthrie investigation, federal investigators have produced a composite image, a face, drawn by a forensic artist working from the accounts of individuals who saw the man that the Nest camera captured in partial profile, that Aldine Meister observed from her bathroom window on a January morning she remembers because of her birthday, and that multiple other witnesses in the Catalina foothills have described in terms consistent enough to support the construction of a single representative image. That image exists. It is in the possession of the federal investigative team. It has been examined by every witness whose account contributed to its construction. It has been processed through the facial recognition infrastructure available to federal law enforcement. And the result of that processing is what this investigation has been building toward since the first Nest camera image was pulled from the footage and the first question was asked about the man whose hat was pulled low and whose face was turned deliberately away from the lens. They drew his face. And what the drawing revealed, what the facial recognition processing produced, what the witnesses confirmed when they looked at the composite and gave the investigators the answer they had been working toward, has changed the operational center of this investigation. The masked man's identity has been revealed. What that identity is, what it means, what it connects to everything the investigation has already built, and why the revelation of a face that spent weeks being deliberately hidden from every camera and every witness is the development that this case has been moving toward since February 1st. That is what follows. Here is what forensic composite art is and what it is not. It is not a photograph. It is not a reconstruction of a face with the precision of a biometric scan or a forensic photograph taken under controlled conditions. It is a disciplined artistic process that translates the verbal and visual memory of human witnesses into a two-dimensional image that represents the consensus of those accounts. That consensus is the key word. A single witness produces a single account. That account is shaped by the conditions of the observation, the duration of the sighting, the emotional state of the witness at the time, and the specific limitations of human visual memory across time. Aldine Meister saw a man from a bathroom window on a January morning. She saw him for a duration she has not publicly specified. She saw him from an elevation and at a distance that affected the resolution of what she could observe. She described him in 8 words. Strange guy with his hat down really low. Those 8 words are operationally specific but forensically incomplete. They describe behavioral characteristics. They do not describe a face. Other witnesses contributed other details. Witnesses whose accounts have not been made public in the same way that Aldine Meister's account was made public. Witnesses who were closer. Witnesses who observed the individual from a different angle. Witnesses who saw him at a moment when the hat was not fully obscuring the features it was designed to hide. Witnesses whose accounts, combined with Meister's account and with the partial facial geometry visible in the Nest camera footage, gave the forensic artist enough to work with. The forensic artist does not draw what any single witness remembers. The forensic artist draws what all witnesses remember together, weighted by the consistency of their accounts and the conditions under which each observation was made. The result is not a perfect likeness. It is a probabilistic image, a face that represents the highest confidence rendering of what multiple independent witnesses saw and what the partial Nest camera imagery confirmed. That image is now in the possession of the federal investigative team, and the facial recognition system that processed it returned a result. Here is what facial recognition processing of a forensic composite produces. This is where precision matters because the gap between what facial recognition can do and what people believe it can do is significant. Facial recognition systems trained on law enforcement databases do not match a forensic composite to a single individual with certainty. They produce a ranked list of candidate matches. Individuals in the database whose facial geometry is consistent with the geometry encoded in the composite image. The ranking reflects the degree of geometric consistency between the composite and each candidate. The top candidates are the individuals whose measured facial features most closely align with what the composite represents. That ranked list is not an identification. It is the beginning of an identification process. Each candidate on the list must be investigated independently to determine whether their presence in the Catalina foothills during the documented surveillance window is consistent with what the investigation has established. Whether their connections, financial, digital, communicative, personal, place them within the network that the 19-hour interrogation disclosure described. Whether their physical characteristics match what witnesses described beyond the facial features encoded in the composite. The facial recognition system returned candidates. The investigation examined those candidates against the existing evidentiary record, and somewhere in that examination, one candidate separated from the others. Not because the facial recognition algorithm assigned them the highest score, because the investigation found that their score on the facial recognition list, combined with everything else the evidentiary record contained, produced a convergence that the other candidates did not produce. That convergence is an identification, not a facial recognition match, an investigative identification built from the composite, the facial recognition output, the witness accounts, the Nest camera footage, the surveillance logs, the interrogation disclosure, the gas station camera footage, and the full body of physical and forensic evidence this investigation has accumulated across weeks of work. That identification has been made. Here is what it means to identify the man whose hat was pulled low. For weeks, the hat was the operational center of a mystery, the deliberate obscuring of a face that knew it was being watched, the behavioral signature of a subject who had assessed the surveillance environment of the Catalina foothills in advance and taken measures to limit what any camera or any witness could record about his appearance. The hat was not a casual choice. It was an operational decision. It was the decision of a person who understood that the difference between being identified and not being identified, in the event that something went wrong and the investigation began, was the distance between a visible face and a hidden one. For weeks, that operational decision held. The Nest camera captured a hat. Aldine Meister described a hat. The gas station camera captured a figure whose facial features were not fully resolved in the raw footage and required enhancement to yield anything usable. For weeks, the hat succeeded in doing what it was designed to do. The forensic composite process does not care about the hat. It assembles from every moment when the hat's coverage was imperfect, every angle at which the brim did not fully extend to the chin, every frame of Nest camera footage where the subject's movement created a momentary gap in the coverage the hat was providing. Every witness account that captured a partial feature, an ear, a jawline, the set of a mouth, the shape of a brow, during a moment when the hat was not performing its function with perfect efficiency. Hats are not perfect instruments of concealment. They are probabilistic. They reduce the probability of facial identification without eliminating it. And when a forensic process is given enough imperfect observations across enough different moments and angles, the probability shifts. The hat that held for weeks against casual observation and Nest camera footage did not hold against the forensic composite process that combined every imperfect observation into a single disciplined image. The hat is no longer sufficient. The face beneath it has been drawn, and the face has been identified. Here is who was in the Catalina foothills on the mornings that the investigation has documented. This is where the identification must be understood in the context of everything the investigation had already established before the composite was drawn. The man whose face is now known to federal investigators did not appear in the Catalina foothills randomly. He appeared there as part of a planned operation with a tunnel, with a walkie-talkie, with a backpack, with a structure of coordination that Tommaso Cioni described over 19 hours in an interrogation room, and that sources confirmed extended further back in time and further across a network of individuals than any single piece of evidence had previously suggested. The identification of the man whose hat was pulled low is not the identification of a lone actor. It is the identification of one node in a network, one visible layer of an operation whose invisible layers the investigation has been mapping through the tunnel, through Warner Parks, through the interrogation, through the 3-week surveillance of Tommaso Cioni, and through the gas station camera 2 miles from the primary crime scene. That node now has a name. That name is inside the federal investigative record. That name has been cross-referenced against every database available to the federal investigative team, against financial records, against travel records, against communication intercepts, against the network of individuals that the 19-hour interrogation disclosure described, against the forensic evidence recovered from the location that Tommaso Cioni kept returning to for 3 weeks. And the cross-referencing produced results that the investigation has not yet officially disclosed. Here is what the witnesses felt when they saw the composite. This is a detail that official records do not capture, but that sources familiar with the process have allowed to surface. The witnesses who contributed to the construction of the composite were shown the finished image as part of the verification process. The forensic composite is not finalized until the contributing witnesses have confirmed that the image is consistent with their recollection. That confirmation is not a simple yes or no. It is a structured process in which each witness is asked to assess specific facial features against their memory of the individual they observed. What sources have described is this. When Aldine Meister was shown the composite image, the image produced a recognition response, not a tentative, uncertain, maybe that could be him response of the kind that compromised witness identifications produce. A recognition response, the specific reaction of a person looking at an image and finding in it the face they saw from a bathroom window on a January morning they remember because it was 3 days after her birthday. That recognition response is documented. It is part of the official evidentiary record, and it is the kind of witness confirmation that strengthens the composite's value as a forensic instrument. Because a composite confirmed by the witness whose account contributed to its construction is a composite that has passed its most fundamental verification test. Other witnesses produced similar responses. The composite did not fail its verification test, it passed, and the image that passed that test is the image that the facial recognition system processed and the investigation examined against its full evidentiary record. Here is what the identification revealed about the timeline of this investigation. The man whose face has now been drawn and identified was not unknown to the investigation before the composite was completed. That is the detail that changes the shape of the revelation. The identification did not introduce a new individual into the investigation's field of view. It confirmed the identity of an individual the investigation had already been examining through other evidentiary channels. That confirmation is operationally significant for a specific reason. An investigative identification that introduces a new individual requires the investigation to build a new evidentiary foundation for that individual from scratch, to establish their connections, their movements, their financial and digital footprint, and their relationship to the network the investigation has already documented. That process takes time, it takes resources, it takes investigative work that has not yet been done. An investigative identification that confirms the identity of an individual already under examination is different. The evidentiary foundation already exists. The connections have already been mapped. The financial and digital records have already been examined. The relationship to the network has already been established through other evidence. The identification adds a face to a profile that already has a name, a history, and an evidentiary record. The composite confirmed a name the investigation already had, and the name it confirmed, now attached to a face drawn from the accounts of witnesses who saw him in the Catalina foothills, is the individual whose full evidentiary profile has been building inside the federal case file across the weeks that the investigation has been running. That profile is now complete in a way it was not before the composite was drawn, because the face is the connection between the person in the database and the person on the street outside Nancy Guthrie's home, and that connection has now been made. Here is what the identification means for the network described in the interrogation disclosure. Tommaso Cioni's 19-hour disclosure named individuals. It described roles. It described a structure of coordination in which different individuals perform different functions across different phases of the operational timeline. The person conducting exterior surveillance, the person managing the tunnel, the person coordinating transport, the person responsible for the secondary location. Each role assigned to an individual. each individual now being examined against the full evidentiary record. The identification of the man whose hat was pulled low places a name and a face at the exterior surveillance phase of that structure. It confirms that the individual performing that function was the individual the investigation had already identified through other means. And it raises the operational question that the investigation is now working to answer. If the exterior surveillance role is confirmed, what does that confirmation tell investigators about the individuals performing the other roles? A network is not identified one node at a time indefinitely. Each confirmed node produces intelligence about the nodes adjacent to it. The financial connections, the communication records, the physical meetings, the logistical arrangements that linked the exterior surveillance role to the tunnel management role, to the transport role, to the secondary location role, are all traceable from the confirmed node. Because the confirmed node was in contact with those other roles, was coordinated with them, was part of the same operational structure, the identification of one face is the identification of one entry point into the full network, and the investigation is now inside that entry point, moving through the connections it produces toward the complete picture of who was responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie and what each of them did. Here is what the man whose face has been drawn did not know when he pulled his hat low and walked slowly past Nancy Guthrie's house. He did not know about Aldine Meister's bathroom window. He had assessed the surveillance environment of the Catalina foothills. He had identified the Nest camera at the front door and taken measures to limit what it could capture. He had mapped the sight lines from neighboring properties and determined that his slow walk past the property, at the distance he maintained from the front of the house, was within acceptable operational parameters for concealment. He did not calculate Aldine Meister standing at her bathroom window getting ready on a January morning 3 days after her birthday. He did not calculate a woman who would later call the Pima County Sheriff after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing. A woman who would describe a strange guy with his hat down really low. A woman whose account would survive the evidentiary scrutiny of a federal investigation and contribute to a forensic composite that would eventually carry his features to a facial recognition database and produce a ranked list of candidates. He calculated the cameras. He did not calculate the neighbor. And it was the neighbor, standing at her bathroom window on a morning she was not trying to observe anything, who saw what the cameras could not fully capture, who provided the partial features, the angle, the moment when the hat was not performing its concealing function with perfect efficiency that the forensic artist needed to construct the image that identified him. That detail matters. The operational sophistication of this crime was considerable. The tunnel, the coordination, the walkie-talkie, the backpack, the carefully managed appearance at a monitored front door, all of it reflected a level of planning that accounted for most of the observable risks in the operational environment. Most, not all. The bathroom window was the one the planning did not account for. And the face it captured, imperfectly at distance, without the knowledge of the woman looking through it, was enough. Here is what happens after an investigative identification is made in a federal abduction case. The identification does not immediately produce an arrest. An arrest requires an arrest warrant. An arrest warrant requires a judicial determination of probable cause sufficient to authorize the detention of the identified individual. The probable cause determination is made by a federal judge reviewing the affidavit submitted by the investigating agents. That affidavit contains the evidentiary basis for the identification, the composite, the witness confirmations, the facial recognition analysis, the cross-referencing against the existing evidentiary record, the connections established through financial, digital, and communication forensics, the relationship to the network described in the interrogation disclosure. That affidavit is being prepared or has been prepared. Its submission to a federal court is the next step in the legal process that the identification has initiated. The judicial review of that affidavit will produce either the issuance of an arrest warrant or a determination that additional evidentiary foundation is required before the warrant can issue. What that determination will be has not been officially confirmed. What sources familiar with the evidentiary posture of the investigation have indicated is that the case assembled around the identified individual is substantial, that the identification is not a standalone forensic event, but the capstone of an evidentiary record that has been building across weeks of intensive investigative work, that the composite and the facial recognition confirmation did not create the case. They completed it.